Appliances, also they're called prosthetics sometimes. We tend to like the term appliance. Prosthetics is more of a medical term, I think. But it's a rubber, it could be just hollow rubber piece, or in the case we usually use foam rubber, or a lot of silicone now, or even gelatin. It's a piece that you make that is applied to the person's face. It's made by, first you take a life cast of a person's face. You take make a plaster duplicate of the person's face. So you model these new features in plasticine, then you make a negative mold of your plasticine sculpture, and the area that was once clay, the clay's cleaned out. The two molds fit together, the positive life cast and the negative mold, and there's a void space in there that was once clay. That void space is then filled with your rubber, or your foam rubber, or your gelatin, whatever it is, and baked in the oven if the foam rubber has to be baked. When it's removed, you have a piece that on the exterior is the exterior that you sculpted with the pores and all in the form. And the interior is like a negative mold of the person's face. So the nose fits exactly on their nose. It fits like it's made for them, because it is. Those are glued on and blended off. And the trick is to really get the edges to be very, very, very thin, so you don't even see them. And that was something that I'd made some foam rubber appliances, but the edges were always pretty obvious. And it wasn't until I met Dick Smith that I learned the trick, which was you want as little with the mold, like as if I did a nose appliance and I had a whole life cast, I'd make a mold that covered the whole thing, and there would be like kind of plaster on plaster contact all through here. There was only the little void space. And Dick explained to me that when you put the rubber in there, you close the two pieces up, you have to squeeze out that excess rubber. So for that rubber to squeeze out through this whole face to get out that mold, you're never going to get it all out, so you never get that little thin edge. So you want to have really little contact there. So what you do is you have your nose, you have the little plaster contact around the edge of it, and then you cover the area that you don't want with a thickness of clay, so that the mold only touches right on the very edge, so the excess can easily squeeze out, and then the mold will close up much easier and tighter. And it's like, oh, why didn't I think of that? Kind of a thing. So through the history of actual appliances, I mean, previous to the time that people were making appliances like that, things were fabricated on a daily basis on the actor's face. The Frankenstein's monster makeup that Jack Pierce did was built up every day out of cotton and collodion, which is this really volatile smelling solvent-y kind of stuff, like a kind of a liquid plastic. And you would put some collodion on, put a piece of cotton on, and paint some more on, and continue laboriously building up. That's why these makeups took 8 hours. It was very hard to keep continuity, and you were basically sculpting it on the face every day, or you did it with nose putty or mortician's wax. Early on, the first appliances that were ever made were actually made out of gelatin, which they used to make flexible molds out of in those days too. They called them glue molds. And gelatin, like the Good Earth, they did some Asian makeups with the eye tab things that they made out of gelatin. And gelatin, like I said, was the very first thing. The problem is that it melts. If a person got too hot, all of a sudden their eyes would melt and things like that. And eventually they started doing what they called sponge rubber when they first started doing it. And they found that you could put air into a rubber and make it softer and flexible. And the Wizard of Oz was one of the first uses of foam rubber. And I, later in my career, had met Charlie Schramm, who was one of the makeup artists on the Wizard of Oz, and one of the lab men, as they called him. And he would talk about foam rubber in those days. And they said they knew that you had to add zinc and you had to add sulfur and you had to add these things to make it work, but they didn't really have a formula. So they said they would just throw the stuff in and beat it up. And said some days it turned out really well, other days it didn't work at all. And another Wizard of Oz story that I liked was that, like all the Munchkins and all the people in Oz all had these bald caps on. And they used to make the bald caps in those days out of the old nitrate film. They actually took the film and put it in acetone and melted it and made this liquid plastic out of it. And some guy's job was, they had these head forms, and he would spend the night painting this plastic on all these head forms. And in the morning, the makeup artist would come and peel these very fresh, very full of acetone things off and glue them onto the little dwarfs and midgets and little people's heads, and through the course of the day, he said the plastic would continue to shrink, which he said at first it improved the look. It's always hard to get a nice, smooth, bald cap. And with the fact that it shrunk, it would get tighter and look better. But they said at the end of the day, all of a sudden, you'd have these Munchkins walking around with these bald caps popping off their heads, and, rubber, foam rubber is still, I mean, one of the best materials. The interesting thing is that it's opaque, and in order to make it look like flesh, you have to paint it to look like flesh, and flesh isn't just one color, and it's a very meticulous paint job that you're doing usually under the, it's, applying a makeup is always like beat the clock, you know, you have this short amount of time. When we paint a fake head, sometimes we'll spend a week on the paint job of a fake head. You can't, you've got an hour to do it, you know. So you have to try to come up with a way to try to make this look like flesh, and it's a lot. It was in the old days we used to use these stipple sponges, and it was a lot of stippling of different colors and layering and stuff. The funny thing was that all of a sudden it started going back to what we first started with, because the opacity was a problem. Somebody, again, I think it was Dick Smith again, kind of rediscovered gelatin and said, you know, gelatin is translucent, and you can intrinsically color it a nice base color, and you have to paint it very little, and it's you know, it's actually kind of a great material. So the gelatin had this whole resurgence of being used by makeup artists as a translucent material, and we still use it. We used it on just recently on Men in Black 2.